Judge mocks teen in court, shocked when she turns out to be a genius attorney. Amelia Carter stood at the defendant's table, gripping a stack of legal documents so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The courtroom was a sea of polished suits, gleaming shoes, and leather-bound briefcases, an arena designed for those with power, experience, and authority. And there she was, a teenager in a hoodie and sneakers, an uninvited guest in a world that wasn't meant for her. The air was thick with condescension, the low murmur of attorneys exchanging amused glances, the smirks of courtroom staff barely concealed. They weren't just skeptical, they were entertained. At the center of it all sat Judge Theodore Grayson, reclining slightly in his chair, one eyebrow arched as he surveyed her like she was some kind of absurd spectacle. His lips curled in a smirk as he tapped his gavel lightly, more for effect than necessity. "Miss Carter, do you even understand where you are?" His voice, thick with mockery, rang through the courtroom, and a ripple of quiet laughter followed. Amelia's stomach twisted, but she held her ground. "This is a court of law," he continued, leaning forward as if addressing a wayward child. "Not a debate club, not a school play, and certainly not a place for... What is this?" He gestured vaguely toward her, his voice dripping with exaggerated amusement. "Casual Friday?" Laughter erupted in the room. Amelia felt her face burn, but she refused to look away. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. She took a breath, forcing herself to steady her voice. "Your Honor, I am here to..." Grayson waved a dismissive hand. "Number, I'm not interested in whatever stunt you're trying to pull. This court does not have time for amateur theatrics." More laughter. This time louder, more confident, emboldened by the judge's blatant disdain. Amelia's heart pounded. She had expected resistance, of course she had. But this was outright humiliation, a performance orchestrated to tear her down before she even had a chance to speak. She lifted her chin, forcing steel into her voice. "Your Honor, if you would allow me to present my argument..." Grayson sighed, exaggerated and dramatic, shaking his head. "I'll allow you to leave, Miss Carter. That would be the best course of action for everyone involved." The room erupted again. A sharp, ringing laugh from one of the prosecutors cut through the air like a blade. Amelia's grip on her documents tightened, her nails pressing into the paper. The injustice of it all was suffocating. They weren't even pretending to be fair. This wasn't about legal precedent, about her qualifications, about whether or not she had a right to be here. It was about power. It was about who was allowed to speak and who was meant to stay silent. She straightened her shoulders. "Your Honor, the law provides every defendant the right to representation. My client..." Grayson slammed his gavel down so hard the sound echoed off the walls. The room silenced instantly. "Enough!" His voice, no longer mocking, was sharp with irritation. "You think quoting legal rhetoric changes the fact that you have no place in this courtroom? That you can just walk in here, dressed like that, and expect to be taken seriously?" He gestured at her clothes again, and a few people chuckled under their breath. Amelia swallowed the rage bubbling inside her. She knew how this worked. If she lost control, if she showed even a flicker of weakness, she would be dismissed as emotional, hysterical, a silly girl playing pretend. Number, she would not give them that. "My appearance has nothing to do with my ability to present a legal argument," she said, keeping her tone even. Grayson let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's rich. You really believe that, don't you?" Amelia refused to flinch. "I believe that justice should be blind." The judge's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he leaned back, arms crossed. "Fine. Go ahead. Enlighten us all. Make your case, Miss Carter." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time since she had stepped into this room, they were listening. Not because they respected her, not because they believed she had something valuable to say, but because they wanted to see her fail. But before Amelia ever set foot in a courtroom, before she dared to challenge a system built to crush people like her, there was a moment, a single, defining moment that changed everything. James Carter wasn't just her brother. He was her hero. He was the kind of person who made justice feel like more than just an abstract concept. Brilliant, driven, and unshakably principled, James had been a rising star in the world of law, a top-tier student who had spent years preparing to take on the very system that would one day betray him. His professors admired his intellect, his classmates envied his confidence, and Amelia, she worshipped the ground he walked on. He was the one who taught her how to argue not just to win, but to expose the truth. The one who had let her sit beside him while he pored over legal textbooks, explaining case law in a way that made even the most complex rulings seem simple. He was going to be the kind of lawyer who made a difference, the kind who stood up for the people who couldn't stand up for themselves. But none of that mattered the night he was arrested. The charges were absurd: a violent assault on a wealthy businessman outside a bar, a man who claimed James had attacked him without provocation. The truth, of course, was far different. The security footage, which could have exonerated James, mysteriously disappeared. The witnesses, at first eager to speak, suddenly grew silent. And the court-appointed lawyer, a tired, overworked public defender who barely glanced at James's file before muttering something about a plea deal. James refused. He knew he was innocent. He believed in the system, in due process, in truth prevailing. He was wrong. Amelia sat in the courtroom the day they sentenced her brother. She was 16, her nails digging into the wooden bench as she listened to the verdict: 3 years in prison. 3 years for a crime he hadn't committed, for a fight he hadn't started, for standing in the wrong place at the wrong time against a man whose wealth ensured he would never lose. She had looked at James, expecting to see rage, expecting him to fight back. Instead, he only met her gaze with a quiet sadness, a resignation she didn't understand then, but would come to know intimately in the years that followed. That was the day something inside her broke. While the world moved on, Amelia locked herself in her tiny bedroom, surrounded by stacks of law books she had borrowed from James's old collection. She pored over cases, reading precedent after precedent until the words blurred together. She memorized statutes, dissected legal loopholes, and traced the patterns of power that dictated who won and who lost in a system that had already proven its corruption. There were nights she didn't sleep, mornings where she woke up with her face pressed against a legal textbook, highlighter ink smeared across her skin. Lily thought she was insane. "Amelia, this isn't your fight," her best friend had said one afternoon, sitting cross-legged on the bed, a bag of chips in her lap. "James is gone. Even if you somehow learn everything, you're not a lawyer. You'll never be one of them." But that was exactly the point, wasn't it? Amelia snapped her book shut and met Lily's gaze with an intensity that made her friend shift uncomfortably. "That's why I have to do it. Because if she didn't, who would? If she walked away, how many more James Carters would be buried beneath the weight of rigged trials and bought verdicts?" She refused to let the system win. She was going to fight, and this time she was going to win. Back to the courtroom. The courtroom was suffocating with tension, every breath thick with the weight of injustice. Amelia stood rigid at the defense table, her fists clenched so tightly around her notes that the edges crumpled beneath her fingers. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room, not with curiosity, not with respect, but with the same cruel amusement they had worn since she first stepped into this chamber. Judge Grayson had made a mockery of her presence, dismissing her as nothing more than a reckless child playing pretend. The prosecution had torn into her case with relish, their smirks widening with every objection sustained, every attempt of hers smothered before it could take root. She was losing. She could see it in the way her client, Mr. Peterson, sat beside her, his hands wringing in silent desperation, his head bowed like a man already resigned to his fate. The system had already decided his guilt. Nothing she said, nothing she did, seemed to matter. And then the heavy double doors of the courtroom slammed open with such force that they crashed against the walls, the sound ricocheting through the chamber like a gunshot. A collective gasp rippled through the room as heads swiveled toward the disruption. A man stood in the doorway, panting as though he had sprinted the entire way. He was disheveled, his tie loosened, his shirt half untucked, sweat beading along his brow. But it was the way he clutched the small, black USB in his hand that sent a shock wave through Amelia's veins. His knuckles were white, his grip trembling, as though he knew the weight of what he carried. "Your Honor," his voice cracked, but there was no mistaking the urgency beneath it. "I have evidence. Evidence that proves this entire case is a setup. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps, whispers, the rustling of papers, the sharp scrape of chairs against the polished floor as attorneys turned to each other in frantic murmurs. Amelia's heart pounded against her ribs, her breath lodged in her throat as she stared at the man, her mind racing. Amelia's heart pounded against her ribs, her breath lodged in her throat as she stared at the man, her mind racing. Who was he? Where had he come from? At the judge's bench, Grayson's expression darkened into a scowl. He slammed his gavel down, demanding order, but the room had already spiraled out of his control. "Who are you?" he barked, his voice laced with irritation. "What is the meaning of this disruption?" The man took a shaky step forward, lifting the USB like a beacon. "My name is Henry Willis," he said, his voice raw, "and I have proof that Mr. Peterson is innocent." The words landed like a gunshot. The room went deathly still. Amelia felt as if the air had been sucked from the courtroom. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, hope flickered in her chest, a small, fragile ember. She turned to her client, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw something other than despair in his eyes. Grayson, however, was not impressed. His scowl deepened, and he pointed a bony finger toward the bailiff. "Remove this man immediately." "No!" Amelia's voice rang out, clear and unyielding. The force of it surprised even her, but she didn't waver. She turned to face the judge, her pulse roaring in her ears. "This is critical evidence. If this man has proof that exonerates my client, then we have a duty an obligation to hear it." Grayson's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening around the gavel. He was cornered, and he knew it. The cameras were rolling. The press was here. To outright dismiss new evidence in front of the entire courtroom would be a stain on his reputation, one even he might not be able to erase. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Then finally, "Approach the bench," he said begrudgingly. Willis strode forward, though his steps were uneven, as if he was still half expecting someone to stop him. He handed the USB to the bailiff, who hesitated only for a moment before moving toward the courtroom's evidence system. The prosecution was already scrambling. Margaret Steele, the lead prosecutor, shot up from her seat. "Your Honor, this is highly unorthodox. We cannot allow—" Grayson held up a hand, silencing her. "The evidence will be reviewed," he said stiffly. His gaze flicked toward Amelia, his eyes cold. "But if this is some kind of stunt, Miss Carter, you will face serious consequences." Amelia lifted her chin, ignoring the icy fear crawling up her spine. "It's not a stunt, Your Honor," she said. "It's the truth." The bailiff inserted the USB into the courtroom's monitor. The screen flickered to life, the loading bar creeping across the bottom. Every second stretched like an eternity. Amelia's nails bit into her palm. Then the footage began to play. A grainy black and white video feed filled the screen. The timestamp showed the date 3 days before Mr. Peterson's arrest. A dimly lit parking garage. A figure standing near a sleek black car. Victor Grant. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The camera angle shifted, capturing another figure stepping into frame. An older man, his face partially obscured by shadows. He carried a briefcase, his movements quick, deliberate. He handed it to Grant, who flipped it open for a brief moment before snapping it shut. Then the two men exchanged a brief handshake, and the older man turned to leave. The video cut to a close-up, a clearer shot. The briefcase had been filled with cash. A gasp broke through the silence. Amelia turned, locking eyes with Grant, who had gone completely still. What is this?" Steele stammered, but her voice wavered. Willis stepped forward. "This," he said, voice steady now, "is the bribe that paid for a false witness statement against Mr. Peterson. This man," he gestured at Grant, "was never a victim. He was part of the setup from the beginning." Grant shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "That footage is doctored." "Is it?" Amelia's voice cut through the room like a blade. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request that this footage be analyzed by forensic experts immediately. But I think we all know what they'll find because this is real." The courtroom buzzed with shock. Grayson's expression had darkened into something unreadable, his fingers drumming against the bench. He looked at Steele, waiting for her to argue, But she said nothing, because there was nothing to say. For the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, Amelia felt the power shift. The jeers, the smirks, the dismissive glances, they were gone. The truth had sunk its claws into the courtroom, undeniable, unrelenting. She turned back to her client, and for the first time he looked like a man who believed he might walk out of here free. Judge Grayson sat rigid in his chair, his fingers tightening around the gavel as the echoes of the damning video still hung in the courtroom, like a ghost that refused to leave. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, the truth burning bright for everyone to see. And yet, as Amelia watched him, she could see at the flicker of defiance, the steely determination of a man unwilling to let go of control. His pride, his authority, his carefully constructed dominion over this courtroom was being threatened, and he would not allow it. The murmur of the spectators swelled, a mix of disbelief, shock, and anticipation crackling through the air. Victor Grant had gone pale, his hands clenching into fists at his side. But it wasn't him Amelia was watching. It was Grayson. He was the real danger now. The judge exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His expression had shifted. Gone was the feigned amusement, the condescending smirk that had belittled Amelia from the moment she had stepped into this courtroom. Now there was only cold calculation. He tapped the gavel lightly against the wood, a rhythmic, almost absent-minded motion, as if considering his next move. Finally, he spoke. "This is highly irregular." His voice was calm, measured, but beneath it lay something sharp, something dangerous. A piece of evidence suddenly materializing at the last minute, from a source that has not been verified. We have no way of knowing if this footage is authentic. A murmur rippled through the room. Amelia's stomach twisted. She knew this tactic. Delay, discredit, distract. Grayson was doing exactly what corrupt men had done for centuries when the truth threatened them. They made people doubt it. She stepped forward, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Your Honor, the video clearly shows Victor Grant accepting a bribe to falsify testimony. This is not just about my client anymore. This is about obstruction of justice, about perjury, about..." Grayson cut her off with a sharp rap of his gavel. "Miss Carter, I will remind you that you are already on thin ice in this courtroom." There it was again, the warning, the veiled threat. Amelia knew what he was doing, reminding her, and everyone else, that he still had the power to shut her down completely. She took a breath, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "Then let's authenticate it," she said. "Let's have forensic specialists examine the footage. If it's doctored, it'll be exposed. If it's real..." Grayson didn't let her finish. "And who provided this footage?" he asked, his gaze flicking toward Henry Willis, who had gone still beside her. "This man? A stranger who bursts into my courtroom unannounced? Someone who conveniently appears with a USB drive at the exact moment you need it most?" Willis stiffened. "I worked for Victor Grant," he said, his voice firm despite the tension pressing down on him. "I was part of his operation. I saw what he did. I saw how this case was manufactured. I knew I had to come forward." Grayson tilted his head, his lips pressing into a thin line. "And we're just supposed to take your word for it? That's why I brought the evidence." Willis shot back. Amelia's heart clenched. She could feel it slipping. Grayson was sowing the seeds of doubt, twisting the narrative in real time, bending the truth to his will. He didn't care about the facts. He cared about control. "Your Honor," she said, stepping forward again, "the prosecution's case is built on testimony that is now proven to be unreliable. We are obligated..." Grayson held up a hand. "You are obligated to follow the law, Miss Carter, and the law requires that all evidence be obtained through proper channels. This video? It came from an unknown source, delivered in an unsanctioned manner." His gaze swept across the room. "There are procedures for a reason. Without proper chain of custody, this footage is inadmissible." A stunned silence fell over the room. Amelia felt as though the ground had just been ripped from beneath her feet. She had known Grayson would resist, but to dismiss the evidence outright? To deny even an investigation? The injustice of it burned in her throat like acid. "That's ridiculous," she said, her voice tight with barely contained fury. "The footage shows Grant accepting a bribe. You can't just ignore it." Grayson's eyes hardened. I can and I will. This court does not entertain theatrics. The words hit Amelia like a slap. She had spent years studying, fighting, preparing for this very moment. She had gathered every piece of evidence, built every argument, clawed her way to this point through sheer force of will, and none of it mattered. Because the system wasn't broken. It was rigged, and Grayson knew it. Victor Grant, sensing his reprieve, straightened in his seat, the color slowly returning to his face. He turned to Margaret Steele, and Amelia saw the ghost of a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He thought he had won. Number Amelia refused to let this end here. She turned sharply to the judge. Then let's put it on record, she said, forcing steel into her voice. Let's put it in writing that despite having clear video evidence, this court is refusing to consider it. A sharp inhale ran through the room. For the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed Grayson's face. Amelia pressed forward. Let's record for all present that this court would rather dismiss crucial evidence than investigate its legitimacy. Because that's what you're saying, isn't it, Your Honor? You don't want the truth examined. You want it buried. The room was deathly silent. Grayson's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched around the gavel, as though resisting the urge to bring it down again. Careful, Miss Carter, he said, his voice dangerously low. Amelia didn't care. Or what? You'll hold me in contempt for demanding that the truth be heard? Grayson's face darkened. Then before he could respond, another voice cut through the silence. Your Honor. Margaret Steele. She stood slowly, smoothing down the front of her blouse. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Amelia could see the flicker of calculation in her eyes. Steele wasn't an idiot. She knew what was happening. She knew that if she let Grayson shut this down completely, it would look like a cover-up, and Steele didn't play to lose. I move that the video be sent for forensic analysis, she said, her voice cool, professional. If the defense insists on authenticity, then we should verify it properly. A shift went through the room. Grayson hesitated. Amelia could see the gears turning in his head, the war between his pride and the reality that he was quickly losing control of the narrative. Finally, with a reluctant sigh, he leaned back. Very well, he said. The footage will be reviewed. The moment Judge Grayson begrudgingly allowed the video to be sent for forensic analysis, Amelia felt a brief flicker of victory. It wasn't much just a crack in the impenetrable wall of corruption that surrounded her, but it was something. And yet, even as she allowed herself that fleeting moment of relief, she should have known that the system wouldn't let her win so easily. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened again, but this time there was no chaos, no frantic footsteps or desperate proclamations of truth. Instead, the air shifted with a new kind of tension, one colder and more calculated. A man stepped inside, his presence sending a ripple through the prosecution's bench. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a battle he hadn't already decided the outcome of. His tailored suit was crisp, his silver hair neatly combed back, his expression unreadable beneath a mask of polite detachment. Margaret Steele immediately stepped aside as he approached, a silent acknowledgement of authority. Amelia's stomach tightened. Whoever this was, he wasn't just another prosecutor. He was someone worse. Judge Grayson barely glanced up before nodding. Ah, Mr. Langford, he said, his tone shifting ever so slightly, taking on a new layer of formality, of respect. I was informed you'd be joining us. Langford. Amelia recognized the name instantly. Ethan Langford wasn't just any lawyer, he was a legal titan, a senior federal prosecutor known for dismantling cases like they were child's play. He was the man prosecutors called when things got messy, when things needed to be cleaned up with surgical precision. And now he was here to bury her. Langford placed his briefcase on the prosecution's table, adjusting his cuffs before speaking. Your Honor, I apologize for the abrupt intrusion, but given the irregularities of this case, the district attorney's office deemed it necessary that I oversee the proceedings moving forward. Grayson inclined his head, as if this had already been arranged, as if Langford's presence was merely a formality. Of course, he said. Amelia's fingers curled into fists. This is ridiculous, she said, forcing steel into her voice. We just presented crucial evidence proving that. Langford turned toward her, his gaze finally settling on her, as if he were only just now acknowledging her existence. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried no warmth. "Ah, Miss Carter," he said smoothly. "It's certainly impressive what you've managed to do here. For someone without a law degree, that is." A sharp pang of fury shot through her, but she refused to react. That was exactly what he wanted to rattle her, to make her defensive. Instead, she lifted her chin. "The truth doesn't require a degree, Mr. Langford. It only requires people willing to fight for it." His smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "That's a noble sentiment," he said. "But unfortunately, the law doesn't operate on sentiment. It operates on procedure. And right now, we have a significant procedural issue on our hands." He turned back to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, while I appreciate the enthusiasm of Miss Carter and her unexpected witness, we cannot ignore the fact that she is not a licensed attorney. Not only does this call into question the legitimacy of her representation, but it also creates a dangerous precedent. We cannot allow legal amateurs to dictate the course of a trial, regardless of how passionate they may be." A murmur of agreement rippled through the prosecution's side of the room. Amelia felt her jaw clench. This was what they always did when the facts weren't in their favor. They attacked the person presenting them. They made it about her, about why she wasn't qualified, about why she shouldn't even be allowed in the room, instead of addressing the corruption staring them in the face. Before she could speak, Langford continued, his voice smooth as silk. "Additionally, I would like to call into question the validity of this so-called evidence. A mysterious man bursting into a courtroom with a conveniently timed USB drive?" He arched a brow, shaking his head with feigned disappointment. "It's not exactly what one would call reliable." Amelia's pulse spiked as she turned to Henry Willis, who sat stiffly at the witness stand, his hands gripping the wooden edges. She could see the fear in his eyes, the growing realization that he was now in the crosshairs. Langford didn't even need to look at him to continue the attack. "Your Honor, I request that this witness be further examined regarding his motivations for presenting this evidence. We need to understand who he is, why he came forward now, and whether he has any personal stake in the outcome of this case." Grayson nodded almost immediately, as if Langford's words had already cemented themselves as fact. "Agreed," he said before turning to Amelia. "Miss Carter, your witness will be questioned." Amelia's nails dug into her palm. This wasn't about seeking truth. This was about discrediting the one person who had risked everything to expose it. Langford adjusted his tie and strode toward Willis, his presence suffocating. "Mr. Willis," he began, his tone light but piercing. "You've made quite the entrance today. Tell me, what exactly prompted you to bring this evidence forward now?" Willis swallowed. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I knew what was happening was wrong." Langford tilted his head. "And yet you waited. You didn't come forward when this alleged corruption was happening in real time. You waited until the trial was already underway. Why is that?" "I was scared," Willis admitted. "Victor Grant isn't. He isn't someone you just go up against." Langford hummed as if considering his words, then turned back to Grayson. "Fear, Your Honor, a powerful motivator, but also a convenient excuse." Amelia's hands slammed onto the table. "Objection!" Grayson waved her off. "Overruled." Langford returned his attention to Willis. "Tell me, Mr. Willis, are you expecting any kind of compensation for this testimony?" Willis's eyes widened. "What? No!" Langford arched a brow. "No financial gain. No promises of leniency should any unfortunate past indiscretions of yours come to light?" Willis shook his head furiously. "I'm here because it's the right thing to do." Langford sighed, shaking his head as he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, while I appreciate this witness's enthusiasm, I believe his motivations are questionable at best. Given the lack of verifiable chain of custody for this evidence, combined with the clear conflict of interest from Miss Carter's involvement, I move that the USB footage be deemed inadmissible." A hush fell over the room. Amelia felt the breath leave her lungs. Number Judge Grayson steepled his fingers, then slowly nodded. "I have to agree. This evidence as it stands lacks proper authentication. It cannot be admitted into the official record." Amelia barely heard the collective exhale from the prosecution side of the room. The weight of the ruling crushed down on her like a vice. They had done it. They had taken undeniable proof and buried it beneath legal red tape. Victor Grant smirked from across the room, and Langford, ever the picture of composure, simply buttoned his suit jacket. They thought they had won. Amelia's fingers tightened against the table. They were wrong. Amelia sat frozen, her mind reeling as the weight of Judge Grayson's ruling crushed down on her like an avalanche. The USB drive, the one thing that could have turned this entire case on its head, was now nothing more than a discarded scrap of evidence, deemed inadmissible by a system that had never been designed for people like her. Her fingers curled into fists against the polished wood of the defense table, but there was nothing she could do. They had buried the truth, not because it wasn't real, not because it wasn't damning, but because the people in power had decided it was inconvenient. Across the room, Victor Grant sat with a smirk barely concealed at the corner of his lips, his confidence restored now that his biggest threat had been neutralized. Margaret Steele looked equally composed, her expression one of restrained triumph, as if this outcome had been inevitable all along. And Langford, calm, collected. Langford had already begun organizing his papers, as though the trial was merely a formality, and his work here was done. Amelia's pulse thundered in her ears. She had fought so hard. She had studied, prepared, clawed her way into this courtroom with nothing but sheer will. And for what? To watch men like Langford effortlessly twist the rules to their advantage? To see the truth discarded like garbage while her client, an innocent man, sat beside her, his life hanging in the balance. The helplessness hit her like a fist to the gut. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to breathe, but it did nothing to quiet the storm raging inside her. The whispers in the courtroom blurred together, distant and meaningless, a droning noise that only reinforced how small she was in this fight. She had believed in justice once. James had believed in it too. And where had that belief gotten him? Behind bars, just like it would get Mr. Peterson. A bitter taste filled her mouth. This wasn't about right or wrong. It had never been. It was about power, about who had the influence, the resources, the connections. Truth didn't matter if the people in control refused to acknowledge it. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as it had been designed to, and she was losing. Her vision blurred for a moment, not from tears, but from exhaustion, frustration, and the creeping doubt that curled around her like smoke. Was she fighting a battle she could never win? Was she foolish to think that someone like her, a teenage girl without a degree, without a title, without an ounce of the authority wielded so effortlessly by the people across the room, could actually make a difference? Grayson's voice pulled her back. We will proceed with closing arguments. It was over, just like that. As if the last 20 minutes hadn't happened. As if the USB, the video, the revelation of Grant's corruption were nothing more than a minor inconvenience that had been neatly swept aside. Amelia swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for her notes. They felt heavier now, like dead weight. She could feel Mr. Peterson watching her, waiting for reassurance she didn't know how to give. He still believed in her, but did she? She forced herself to straighten, inhaling deeply as she looked at the faces in the room. Grant's smug satisfaction, Langford's effortless control, Steele's quiet victory, Grayson's unwavering indifference. The deck was stacked against her. The law wasn't on her side, but she wasn't done yet. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. Amelia refused to let the verdict define her, refused to let them erase the truth with bureaucracy and legal maneuvering. She had seen corruption win too many times before. She had watched it steal her brother's freedom, manipulate the law, and bury justice beneath layers of power and privilege. But she wasn't done, not yet. That night, she met Lily and Henry Willis in the dimly lit back room of an old bookstore, one of the few places they knew they wouldn't be overheard. Stacks of legal documents, case files, and her own meticulously handwritten notes were scattered across the wooden table. A single desk lamp cast long shadows on their faces, amplifying the intensity of what they were about to do. This isn't just about James, Amelia said, flipping through a file, or Mr. Peterson. Grant has been doing this for years, fixing cases, silencing witnesses, falsifying evidence. He didn't just destroy my brother's life. He's done it to dozens of people. Henry leaned forward, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He still looked shaken from his brutal cross-examination in court, but there was something else in his eyes now: determination. I worked for Grant long enough to know he wasn't acting alone. He had helped prosecutors, judges, law enforcement. You don't get away with something like this unless you have powerful people protecting you. Lily, arms crossed, exhaled sharply. And now, you're saying we're up against more than just one corrupt lawyer? We're up against an entire network? Amelia nodded grimly. That's exactly what I'm saying. The realization settled over them like a storm cloud. They weren't just fighting Victor Grant. They were fighting an entire system built to protect men like him. We need proof, Amelia continued. Something undeniable. If we can link Grant to other wrongful convictions, if we can expose his network, they won't be able to bury it. Not this time, Henry nodded, his expression tightening. There are records, digital footprints. Even if they try to erase them, there's always something left behind. Amelia's mind was already racing ahead. Then that's where we start. The next few days were a blur of research, digging through legal archives, accessing old case files, and searching for patterns. They worked in secrecy, meeting in places where they wouldn't be followed, speaking in hushed tones, always watching their backs. And then they found it. Amelia sat frozen in front of her laptop, her eyes scanning the screen. "Oh my God!" Lily leaned over her shoulder, brow furrowed. "What is it?" Amelia's fingers trembled as she pointed at the list in front of her. "It's not just James, not just Peterson. Grant was involved in at least 20 other cases where evidence mysteriously disappeared, where key witnesses changed their statements, where innocent people were sent to prison on fabricated charges." Henry whistled lowly. "This is bigger than I thought." Amelia exhaled slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. "It's a pattern, and if we can see it, others will too. We just have to get this in front of the right people." Lily hesitated. This is dangerous." Amelia met her gaze, her resolve unwavering. "I know." The warning came that night. Amelia returned home after another long day of digging, exhaustion weighing on her limbs. But the moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. Her apartment had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, papers scattered across the floor, bookshelves overturned. Every piece of evidence she had gathered, the files, the notes, the court transcripts, was gone. Her breath hitched as she stepped forward, heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking as she called Lily. "Amelia," Lily answered instantly, sensing the panic in her voice. "My apartment," Amelia whispered. "Someone's been here. Everything's gone." A beat of silence, then Lily's voice, tight and controlled. "Get out of there, now." Amelia turned, heading for the door, when she saw it. A single envelope sat on the kitchen counter, stark against the chaos. With hesitant fingers, she picked it up and unfolded the note inside. The words were scrawled in bold, precise letters. "Stop now or you'll regret it." The blood drained from her face. This wasn't a random break-in, it was a message. She wasn't just uncovering the truth, she was getting too close. And now someone was making sure she knew it. She met Lily and Henry in a secluded parking lot an hour later. Henry paced back and forth, rubbing his temple. "They're watching us. They know what we're doing." Lily crossed her arms, her expression tight with frustration. "And now they've taken everything." Amelia stared at the note in her hand, her pulse steadying. "They think this will scare us into stopping," Henry scoffed. "It should. Amelia, this isn't just intimidation anymore. These people, they don't play fair. They don't leave loose ends." Amelia looked up at him, her voice firm. "Then we don't give them a reason to think we're a loose end." Lily frowned. "What are you saying?" Amelia took a deep breath, then met both of their gazes. "We keep going, but we do it smarter. We back everything up. We go public the moment we have enough. We make it so big, so undeniable, that they can't just sweep it under the rug." Henry hesitated, then sighed. "You're insane." Amelia gave a wry smile. "Probably." Lily exhaled sharply but nodded. "Then let's bring them down." This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Amelia knew she couldn't do this alone. The break-in, the stolen files, the warning they weren't just scare tactics. They were a message. She had pushed too far, and now the people she was after were pushing back. Hard. If she kept moving forward recklessly, they wouldn't just take her evidence next time. They'd take her. That's why, 2 days later, she found herself sitting in the corner booth of a nearly empty diner, her hoodie pulled up to obscure her face, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across from her sat Sarah Green, a name Amelia had only whispered about before, but now clung to like a lifeline. Sarah wasn't just any journalist. She was the kind who had made powerful enemies, the kind who had exposed corruption at the highest levels, the kind who had been threatened more times than she could count and kept going anyway. If anyone could help her blow this case open, it was Sarah. The reporter studied her with sharp, calculating eyes, drumming her fingers against the chipped tabletop. "So," she said finally, voice low but firm, "tell me why I should risk my career, hell, my life for you." Amelia didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single document, one of the few pieces of evidence she had managed to salvage after the break-in. She slid it across the table. Sarah's gaze flicked down. It was a case summary, one of Victor Grant's past convictions, a man wrongfully imprisoned based on fabricated evidence. A case that bore chilling similarities to James's. Sarah's fingers tightened around the paper. "I remember this," she murmured. Sarah's fingers tightened around the paper. "I remember this," she murmured. Amelia leaned forward, lowering her voice. "It wasn't just one case. I have proof that Grant has manipulated trials for years, that he's had witnesses paid off, evidence destroyed, lives ruined, all to serve the people who keep him in power." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes narrowing as if she were weighing something. Then finally she sighed. "You have more?" Amelia hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Not with me. But yes." Sarah leaned back. "Good, because I don't gamble on half-truths. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. That means gathering every piece of evidence, verifying every detail. Once we go public, they will come for you. And if we don't have enough to make this case bulletproof, you'll be the one left standing in the wreckage." Amelia exhaled, her grip tightening around her coffee cup. "I understand." Sarah nodded once, satisfied. "Then let's get to work." For the next week, they worked in secret. Amelia, Lily, and Henry dug through every source they could find: legal records, news archives, witness statements, anything that could link Grant to a pattern of corruption. Sarah, meanwhile, worked her own contacts, pulling in favors from former prosecutors, whistleblowers, and even an ex-FBI analyst who had been blacklisted after exposing internal misconduct. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Grant's fingerprints were everywhere, hidden behind shell companies, disguised through judicial loopholes, buried beneath mountains of red tape. He wasn't just a corrupt lawyer. He was a key player in an entire network of legal manipulation, working alongside businessmen, politicians, and even members of law enforcement. One night, Amelia sat in Sarah's small apartment, a whiteboard covered in names, dates, and arrows staring back at her. The web of corruption was sprawling, and the deeper they dug, the more terrifying it became. Sarah crossed her arms as staring at the board. "This is bigger than I thought." Amelia nodded, her stomach twisting. "This isn't just about getting justice for James anymore. If we take Grant down, we expose everything." Sarah turned to her. "Are you ready for that?" Amelia met her gaze without hesitation. "I don't have a choice." They needed one final piece, something irrefutable, something that even Grant's allies couldn't spin or suppress. That's when Henry, hunched over his laptop, let out a slow whistle. "You're not going to believe this," he muttered. Amelia and Sarah rushed over, eyes scanning the screen. Henry had hacked into an encrypted database, a last resort move, one that could get them all arrested if they weren't careful. But the risk had paid off. The file on the screen wasn't just another case record. It was a direct communication. Emails between Grant and a high-ranking official, emails detailing payments, instructions, and explicit confirmation that multiple cases had been fixed to serve their agenda. Sarah inhaled sharply. This is the kind of thing that brings people down." Amelia's pulse pounded in her ears. Then let's make sure it does. As dawn broke on the day of the final trial, Amelia knew the system wouldn't go down without a fight, but she hadn't expected them to strike back this brutally. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Amelia could feel it pressing down on her, an invisible weight squeezing the air from her lungs. This was it, the final battle. The moment where everything would either fall apart or explode into the truth she had fought so desperately to reveal. She had prepared for every possible counterattack, anticipated every dirty trick the prosecution might throw at her, but she hadn't expected this. Ethan Langford stood at the prosecution's table, his face a mask of cool confidence as he slid a thick folder across the bench. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and unwavering, "the prosecution has obtained new evidence that directly implicates the defendant, Mr. Peterson, in the embezzlement scheme. We request that this be submitted into the official record immediately." Amelia's heart pounded. This wasn't possible. They were grasping at straws, desperate to regain control, but what could they possibly have? Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses, flipping open the folder. His eyes scanned the pages, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he nodded. "Proceed." Langford turned toward the jury, his movements slow and deliberate, like a hunter playing with his prey. "The defense has spent this entire trial arguing that Mr. Peterson is the victim of a conspiracy, that he was framed." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But these emails sent from Mr. Peterson's own company account tell a different story." A sharp murmur rippled through the courtroom. Amelia stiffened as Langford gestured toward the bailiff, who handed a printed stack of emails to the judge and jury. The moment Amelia's eyes landed on them, her blood ran cold. They looked real. Every email was detailed, carefully structured, the language professional yet unmistakably damning. Messages between Peterson and another executive discussing the transfer of funds, the intentional misallocation of company resources. Every single line was designed to destroy him. Peterson inhaled sharply beside her. "I never wrote these," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Amelia's jaw tightened. "I know." She shot to her feet. "Your Honor, these emails are fabricated." Langford barely glanced at her, shaking his head with feigned disappointment. "Miss Carter, I understand this must be difficult for you, but denial will not change the facts. These emails were obtained directly from the company's internal servers. They are legitimate." "Then we demand forensic analysis," Amelia snapped, her voice razor sharp. "I know for a fact that these weren't written by my client. The metadata, the timestamps, if we examine them, we'll see the truth." A tense pause filled the room. Then Judge Grayson sighed, setting the documents down with deliberate care. "Motion denied." The words slammed into Amelia like a physical blow. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. "What?" Grayson adjusted his glasses, his face devoid of sympathy. "This court will not entertain another delay. The prosecution's evidence is admissible. Your so-called forensic analysis is unnecessary." A stunned silence fell over the room. Amelia felt the floor shift beneath her. Her breath caught, disbelief clawing at her chest. "You're allowing falsified evidence into the record without even verifying its authenticity?" Grayson's expression hardened. "Miss Carter, I will remind you once again, you are dangerously close to being held in contempt." Amelia's fingers dug into the table. The injustice of it burned like acid in her throat. She could hear the whispers from the spectators, the murmurs of uncertainty from the jury. This wasn't just bias. This was outright sabotage. Langford turned to face her fully now, that infuriating smirk tugging at his lips. "It seems, Miss Carter, that no matter how hard you fight, the facts will always win in the end." The courtroom murmured again. Amelia could feel it, their belief slipping, their doubt rising. They were losing. She had fought against impossible odds before, but this was different. This wasn't just a battle for truth. This was a war against an entire system determined to crush her. And if she didn't act fast, it would. Amelia felt the walls closing in. The fake emails had shifted the momentum of the trial, and Langford knew it. The jury, once hesitant, was now teetering toward conviction. Judge Grayson had all but ensured that her objections would go unheard, and Victor Grant sat in the shadows, watching with cold satisfaction. They thought they had won. They were wrong. Amelia inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay composed. She wasn't done. Not yet. Her fingers moved swiftly, flipping through her files until she found what she was looking for: a single business card, slightly bent at the edges. She glanced toward the back of the courtroom, locking eyes with Lily, who nodded in silent understanding. Then, without hesitation, Amelia turned back to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm, "since you refuse to allow forensic analysis, I've taken the liberty of arranging for an independent digital forensics expert to examine the prosecution's emails. He's waiting outside this courtroom right now." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Langford's expression barely faltered, but Amelia could see the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of calculation behind his eyes. Grayson sighed, shaking his head. "Miss Carter, this is highly—" "You allowed fabricated evidence into the record," Amelia cut him off sharply, stepping forward. "You overruled every objection I made to verify its authenticity. If you refuse to let a forensic specialist examine it now, then this courtroom will have undeniable proof that you are actively obstructing justice." Gasps filled the room. Grayson's fingers twitched around his gavel, but he hesitated. He could feel the weight of the room shifting against him, and for the first time his authority was cracking. Langford took a measured step forward. "Your Honor, this is a blatant attempt to delay the proceedings." "Then let's settle it quickly," Amelia shot back. "If the emails are real, we'll see that in minutes. Unless, of course, the prosecution has something to hide." A beat of silence. Grayson's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Fine," he said through clenched teeth. "Bring them in." The doors swung open, and a man in his early 40s entered, his posture sharp, his laptop tucked under one arm. His name was Ryan Calloway, one of the best forensic analysts in the country, and someone Amelia had convinced to take on this case when she realized the prosecution would do anything to crush her. "Let's make this quick," Grayson muttered. Ryan sat at the prosecution's table, his fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard. The room was silent as he pulled up the email metadata, dissecting the information with clinical precision. Minutes passed. Then Ryan exhaled, looking up. "These emails," he said, his voice steady but damning, "were forged." The courtroom exploded. Langford's mask of composure shattered, his mouth opening slightly as if to protest, but no words came. Grayson paled. Amelia saw the ripple of doubt now surging through the jury, through the spectators, through every person who had believed the prosecution's narrative. Amelia seized the moment. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "this means that the prosecution knowingly presented falsified evidence. If we do not throw out their case immediately, this trial is no longer about justice, it's about power protecting power." Langford was already recovering, already pivoting. "We were misled," he started, his voice smooth but urgent. "The prosecution had no knowledge that these emails were enough." The voice came from the back of the courtroom. Henry Willis stepped forward. For the first time, Amelia saw real fear flicker across Langford's face. "I have something to say," Willis announced, his voice louder now, stronger, "and it's about Victor Grant." The air turned electric. Grayson opened his mouth, but Willis wasn't waiting for permission. He strode to the center of the courtroom, pulled a flash drive from his pocket, and held it up. "This," he said, "contains financial records, payments, transfers, deposits into offshore accounts. And do you know whose name is all over them?" He turned, his eyes locking onto Victor Grant. "You!" Grant shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "This is absurd." "You paid off judges," Willis continued, his voice unshaken. "You fixed trials. You manufactured evidence. And you made damn sure that anyone who got in your way disappeared." Langford was already moving toward the judge's bench, his face carefully blank. "Your Honor, we need to—" Grayson banged his gavel. "Order! I will have order in this." But before he could finish, Willis turned toward him. "And you, Judge Grayson," Willis said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You're on the list." The room went dead silent. Amelia felt her breath hitch. For a moment, Grayson said nothing. He simply sat there, his fingers tightening around his gavel, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might snap. Then slowly, he turned to Langford. Langford hesitated, then sighed. Your Honor, he said quietly, I request a recess. Grayson didn't respond. The door to the courtroom opened, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. The lead officer's expression was grim. Victor Grant, he said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber. You're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and bribery of a public official. Chaos erupted. Grant's face twisted in fury. This is ridiculous. I am not. The officers grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back as they cuffed him. He struggled, hissing curses under his breath. But it was over. Judge Grayson looked like a man drowning. Amelia could see it in his eyes, the rapid-fire calculations, the desperate attempts to salvage himself. You too, Your Honor. The second officer's voice was almost gentle. Grayson's face turned ashen. What? We have a warrant, the officer said, stepping forward. We'll be escorting you for questioning regarding these new allegations. For the first time, Grayson had nothing to say. Amelia stood perfectly still, her heart pounding. It was happening. The system was finally breaking. As Grant was dragged from the courtroom, as Grayson sat frozen in his own downfall, Amelia let herself take a single, shaky breath. She had won, but deep down she knew this was just the beginning. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, every pair of eyes fixed on the judge who held the fate of James Carter in his hands. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on Amelia's chest like a weight she could no longer bear. She had fought for this moment through deception, corruption, and threats that should have broken her, but she had endured. And now, as she stood in the front row, her fingers clenched tightly together, she braced herself for the final verdict. Judge Holloway, a man known for his reserved demeanor, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. His expression was unreadable as he looked down at the case file before him. The silence in the room was absolute. Then finally he spoke. After reviewing the newly uncovered evidence, including falsified testimonies, suppressed security footage, and proof of prosecutorial misconduct, he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The court finds that James Carter's original conviction was wrongful. His sentence is hereby vacated, and all charges against him are dismissed. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement, nothing but the sheer impact of those words crashing over Amelia like a tidal wave. Then chaos. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the courtroom. James, seated beside his court-appointed lawyer, inhaled sharply, his hands gripping the table as if grounding himself in reality. And then, before anyone could stop her, Amelia moved. She ran to him, barely aware of the reporters scrambling to capture the moment, barely aware of the onlookers whispering, barely aware of anything other than the fact that her brother, her James, was finally free. She reached him just as he turned toward her, his eyes wide, disbelieving. And then, without a word, she threw her arms around him. You did it, James murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. You actually did it. Amelia squeezed her eyes shut, holding on tighter. We did it, she whispered back. I promised you, James. I promised I'd never stop. James exhaled a shaky breath, stepping back just enough to look at her. His face had changed since the last time they had been together like this. There were lines of exhaustion, of pain etched into his features, but beneath it, she saw something else. A spark of the old James, the brother who had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer, the brother who had told her that justice mattered. He wiped at his eyes and let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh. You're incredible, you know that? Amelia smiled, a real smile this time, one that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. Took you long enough to figure that out. The victory was theirs, but Amelia knew the fight wasn't over. James may have been free, but how many others were still behind bars, trapped by the same corrupt system that had nearly swallowed him whole? How many more innocent people were being used as pawns, discarded when they were no longer useful? She had seen firsthand how the law could be twisted, how power could silence the truth, and she was done watching from the sidelines. A week after James's release, she stood at a press conference, cameras flashing in her face, microphones shoved toward her. She wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. She had faced monsters in suits, men who thought they could crush her just because she was young, because she wasn't qualified. But they had been wrong. "My name is Amelia Carter," she said, her voice unwavering, cutting through the noise like a blade. "I may not have a law degree yet. I may not have years of experience in a courtroom, but I have something that men like Victor Grant never did." She let the silence stretch for a moment, feeling the weight of every reporter, every camera, every eye in the country locked onto her. Then she delivered the final blow. "I have the truth, and I intend to fight for it." More flashes, more noise, but Amelia wasn't done. "I spent the last year fighting for justice outside the system," she continued, "and now I intend to fight from within it." She took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking the words she had been holding in for days. "I will be applying to law school, I will become a lawyer, and I will make sure that no one, no innocent person, has to suffer the way my brother did." The crowd erupted. James, standing just to the side, gave her a nod of approval. Lily grinned at her from the front row. Henry, arms crossed, let out a rare smile. She had spent her entire life being underestimated. Not anymore. She was done playing their game. Now it was time to change the rules. Victor Grant may have fallen, but the shadows he left behind still lingered. His network of corruption, though fractured, was not entirely gone. Some of his allies remained in the system, hidden behind polished suits and empty smiles, waiting for their moment to reclaim what they had lost. They whispered threats in the dark, tested Amelia's resolve with quiet warnings, and moved in the background like ghosts clinging to a dying empire. But Amelia wasn't afraid. She had fought too hard, endured too much, to let fear dictate her next move. She knew now that justice was not given, it was taken, wrestled from the grip of those who believed they could control it. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would never let them twist the law to serve the powerful again. The scene shifts. A grand courtroom. The air is thick with tension, but this time, Amelia isn't the desperate outsider fighting against impossible odds. She isn't standing alone, pleading for someone to listen. She is standing tall, a lawyer's badge pinned to her blazer, confidence radiating from every step she takes toward the defense table. The judge enters. The murmurs die down. The world is watching. She exhales, places her hands on the table, and meets the eyes of those who expect her to falter. She doesn't. "I'm here to protect those who need protecting," she says, her voice firm, unshaken, "and I will not stop." The screen fades to black. Do you believe in justice? If you do, like and subscribe because the fight isn't over yet.